Welcome back to the second part in our three-part series on wrestling with the legacy of the residential school system. In the first section, which you can find the link for down below, we discussed what Christianity's response to the residential school system, the discovery of the graves at Columbus, and the consequences created by that school system specifically for the indigenous community. What should be our response as Christians to it? How do we respond as a global community, as a national community? And now what we're looking at today is going to be our personal response. And then in a few weeks when I put out the next video, it's going to be looking at what our local congregation, what our response can be. And so that's talking about, in the case of our congregation, it'll be the Ottawa and Smith Falls Grace Communion International congregations that I'm talking about there. So first we're going to be talking, however, today about what is our personal response to wrestling with the legacy of the residential school system. How have you responded to it? Perhaps you have responded with avoidance. Avoiding the topic, avoiding it in the news, not having to deal with it. And perhaps that is because the horror is too great when we do look at it. Perhaps you have responded with denial, claiming that maybe it never happened the way that people say it has. Perhaps regret at what has occurred, or anger at those responsible for it. A sense of injustice with the way things have been handled and the fact it happened at all. Fear at such things happening again. Indignation that it could occur in a country like Canada. Confusion as to how all of this could have come about, and some of us not know as much as we probably ought to have about it. A sense of rage or a desire to justify ourselves might come into place. I want to put it to you that the thing that we are called to be responding with on a personal level when it comes to a subject matter like this is compassion. When it comes to anything to do with grief or harm that has been laid or done to another person, our response as Christians is to be compassionate. We are to be like the Good Samaritan, seeking to care for those in need, regardless of any other circumstances. The Good Samaritan could have had a lot of questions that popped into his head that stopped him from going and helping the person by the side of the road, but he did it anyway. And this is key in our understanding of how we deal with news and information that we don't necessarily want to process. And I want to put it to you that it is very natural not to want to process this information. Does anyone really want to talk about the death of children? No. No, not the people who lost their children don't want to talk about it. They want their children to be with them, to be alive still, to be in their arms, and to have grown up full lives. And so it is that we have to have a sense of compassion before anything else. Last time, in my last video, we talked about how we are called to mourn with those who mourn. And this is still going to be the key verse we're engaging with today. Because it is an act of compassion to mourn with those who mourn. To recognize that in the midst of grief, we should not be justifying our actions or the actions of those in the past. We should not be denying elements of what happened. You see, the more and more I have been in conversations with people about this subject, the more it has become apparent that the natural inclination that we have, especially as Caucasian white Canadians, is to try to justify the past. Not to say that it was right, but to imply that maybe there was information we don't have. Maybe something occurred along the way that we just need that piece of information to come to light that will suddenly put this all in a better perspective for us. I want to just say right now, that's likely never going to happen with anything. This is this kind of cognitive dissonance that people have, where we always want, I say they, this is something I do too, we always want and wish for the scenario that fits with our worldview. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is that if you have grown up within the context of colonial rule, and what I mean by that is a country, any given country that has this colonial, was once a colonial power or part of a colonial power, and then your whole view on what that meant has to shift, because for many years the teaching has been that the British Empire, which once controlled 1/4 of all the landmass in the world, wasn't that an incredible, wonderful thing that we were able to do that. But of course, as we recognize more and more the horrific impact that has had on that 1/4 of the landmass across the world, we realize no, it was a wonderful thing only for those who reaped the benefits. And that's the same with everything. You often hear people talk about how, oh, the past was simply times, or better times. And you always have to ask the question, better for who? Who was it better for? And the general rule of thumb is it's better for white Caucasian men. That's usually, if you go back into the past, that's who it was better for. It wasn't necessarily better for many other groups of people, especially in North America, especially in the West. And we need to recognize that that's a reality. We can't avoid it. We can't hide from it. We can't deny it. And we need to avoid this, the incredible efforts our brains will go to protect our psyches from finding out that something we once believed was true is not true anymore. And so when we talk about mourning with those who mourn, one of the things we have to do is that we have to acknowledge the reality of the situation. I said that we needed to listen, to dwell, to internalize what has occurred. And what the instinctive response is not to listen, it's to justify, it's to deny, it's to seek alternatives. And instead I'm saying we are still being called to listen, to dwell, to internalize. Does that mean that we necessarily agree with absolutely everything another group says just because of the having been mistreated by colonial powers in the past, by the church in the past, or by, say, our ancestors in the past? No, it's not. This is not a case of total cultural climatization between these groups. All of a sudden we say, well, no, we will take on that culture as well. Rather, what it is it's a recognition that when something horrific has occurred in the past and it is brought to our attention, we do not shy away from it. We do not shy away from it. Because this tendency to say, but what about this? So let me give you a couple of scenarios that have been presented to me. So this is not so much theoretical, but we're talking about some actual things that have been mentioned. On the previous video, there was a comment that was made by someone, I don't think connected with the church, but who basically says, give me the facts. It says, lay out where exactly are these graves, who found them, as though that information, for one, is not easily accessible. It is very easily accessible to find that information. But also as though that was somehow the point. That if the graves couldn't be found, or if it was found that the children died of something else, this is the other thing that frequently comes up, we don't know what they died of, as if that somehow justified entire generations of children being taken from their parents at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6 and not ever seeing them again. Or when they do see them again, not for 10, 12, 13, 14 years, and having been forced to have a totally different cultural outlook on life. We should not neglect that at the root of the residential school system is state and church-sponsored kidnappings. Right? That is what occurred. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't try to imply that somehow if one person had gone through the school and had a good experience, that meant it was a good thing. No. No, these children were kidnapped by the state, and churches were complicit. If we do not acknowledge that reality, if we do not see that and say that is horrific and wrong, then what we are essentially doing is saying that that is acceptable behavior. Kidnapping is acceptable behavior. The separation of children from parents along ideological grounds is acceptable behavior, which I'd point out is the same thing that was often done in Nazi Germany, in other extreme dictatorships that we categorically regard as evil. So we need to avoid this trap of saying, well, I need more information to be able to come to my conclusion about what I think about the residential school system. The information is there. There's no but what about that's suddenly going to make what happened right. And that is a reality we have to come to terms with. It was wrong. It was wrong. And that's something that we have to be very clear about. That's part of being compassionate. Part of compassion is seeing the harm done to another, giving a voice to it, and making sure that we do not in any way downplay it. I recall many years ago, one of the youth came to me when I was the youth pastor. Their friend had died and they said they were angry with God. And I was not compassionate in my response. I wasn't, I would say, especially callous either. I was kind of middle of the road. I said to them, well, that's not a reason to be mad at God. And of course, I recognize now that actually, no, it is. This is a response we often have when evil occurs. We get angry with God. And God is capable of dealing with our anger and helping us work through it. But rather than enter into the grief that this girl was feeling at the loss of her friend, I glossed over it. I minimized it. And it was harmful, and it was not compassionate. And that is what we are doing when we start seeking other justifications for what has occurred. But we're also doing something on a theological level that is incorrect. In Romans 3:23, we're told that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And when we try to justify the past, when we try to act like some of the things that were done in the name of colonialism, in the name of trying to get Western culture and make that dominant over other cultures, when we try to act like these things are okay, we're almost trying to say, well, those aren't, or not okay. Let me correct my wording there. When we try to justify those actions. And when I say justify, I mean imply that there was some scenario in which they were required or they made sense. And so a justification you might hear today, for example, as well, our technological development is where it is now because of the colonial era. That's true, but that does not justify the actions that got us there, nor does it imply that in any way slavery and everything else that went with it was okay because of where we are now. We can't think that way. But why do we think that way? That's what I want to pause and consider for a moment. Why is there an instinct when we have learned that someone in our past, whether it be an ancestor, whether it be a government, whether it be church groups, whatever it may be, something that we feel affiliated with, is accused of having done something wrong, we seek to go on the defensive straight away? Why, when we are accused of doing something wrong, is our instinct to defend ourselves even when we know we are in error? Why is that so strong? Well, I would argue that's part of the brokenness of the world. But it's also when we as Christians indulge that mindset, we are not recognizing this reality that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It is not a surprise that people in the past failed and failed hard. It's not a surprise when people in the present fail. It's not a surprise when people in the past sin, Christians or otherwise. It's not a surprise when people in the present sin, Christians or otherwise. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so we must recognize that sin is sin, wrong is wrong. And so kidnapping children from parents is wrong. The children dying in those homes alone is wrong. We shouldn't somehow try to grade the sin as though finding out how the children die would make it any better. Evil occurred. That is what matters. And it does matter to those who have survived to find out what happened to their families. I think that is key and vital and part of reconciliation and healing. But it shouldn't be the focus of those who did not go through it as though somehow it might change their viewpoint. The other problem that you have when you start justifying the actions of the past or your own actions in the present is that you are now denying the follow-up to that verse. It continues in verse 24 of chapter 3 of Romans, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. We are all justified before God. We do not need to defend our legacy, if you will, in this world. We do not need to say that the fact that we now live in the country we live in now and have the privileges that we have, we do not need to go and make a defense of those things, justify those things, because in so doing, we are forgetting that if we have done wrong, the only way it is healed and rectified is through Jesus' justifying work upon the cross. And so we end up in this mindset that does not give due homage to what Jesus did on the cross. Focusing on justifying ourselves and our culture in the world, it is 100% futile. Because all cultures are broken. All people are broken. But it also denies Christ's justifying work on the cross, because we're saying that what matters to us is that our culture and the identity we have in that be correct. But that's not what matters. It's our identity as fully justified, healed, and reconciled human beings through the work of Jesus on the cross that matters. Not what the church did in the past, the church that is made up of fallen, broken people. So when it comes to our personal response, we come back to this same thing: compassion. Compassion is what we have been called to respond with. And I urge you, respond compassionately to those around you. Do not seek to justify yourself. Do not seek to justify your culture. Seek to be compassionate and loving, because in so doing, you are living as a redeemed, born-again Christian whose identity is found in Christ and not their culture. And in fact, when we respond with all of those things I mentioned at the beginning, horror, fear, anger, rage, confusion, denial, avoidance, indignation, injustice, regret, and justification, these, by and large, are all inward, self-centered reactions. They're looking at how we deal with what we have seen and heard. And it is not that we do not have to process that. We should be horrified. We should have a sense of indignation and a feeling of injustice at what occurred. Those are appropriate responses. But when we allow ourselves to be defined instead by avoiding the issue or denying that it happened, or mournfully beating ourselves up about it. We're looking inward. But the reason we turn to compassion is because compassion looks outward. It is other-centered. So I encourage you, as followers of Jesus Christ, that to be compassionate to those around you. This is what I think our personal response has to be defined by. Take care, and God bless, and share the compassion with Jesus with all that come before you.